Hi, Greathearts! My name is Corey Wozniak, and I am a 6th year English teacher out of Las Vegas, and I'm very excited to do this teaching demonstration for you today. Today, class, we're going to read a poem called The Chimney Sweeper by William Blake. William Blake is one of my absolute favorite poets of all time. I need you to imagine with me for a moment. Close your eyes. Imagine that we're in London in the late 1700s, and London is very quickly industrializing and urbanizing, which is to say that people are moving en masse from the country into the city for new factory jobs. And as these people move into the city is getting more and more dense, more and more crowded. And it's beginning to experience some of those same problems that are common to all big cities. London is becoming dirtier. Pollution is beginning to blot out the sun. Poor men, women, and children are lining the streets. And in the midst of all this, people are walking the streets and hawking their wares. They're crying out for you to buy their services. And amongst those salesmen are children as young as 4 years old who are crying out in their high, prepubescent voices, "Sweep, sweep, sweep." These are the chimney sweepers. Now, if you know already the dimensions of a normal-sized piece of paper. A normal-sized piece of paper is 8.5 inches by 11 inches. Now the chimneys in London, and these are the chimneys that the chimney sweepers are moving up and down, are very narrow. The smallest chimneys in London could be as small as 81 square inches or 9 inches by 9 inches, or a little bit smaller than the average sized piece of paper. Imagine for a moment that you're trying to move through up and down a space like this. You're trying to move your shoulders through them and move up and down. Now, an adult like me could never move in a space like this. So if I were a master sweeper, what I would do is I would hire young children, again as young as 4, 5, or 6 years old, to be my apprentices. And it was they that I would send up and down the chimneys. Now, the best age for a chimney sweep apprentice was 6 years old, because at 6 you're still small, but you're a little bit stronger, and so you can move up and down the chimneys on your knees and elbows. The work is extremely dangerous, and the boys, because the spaces were so narrow, could get jammed in the chimney sweeps if they brought their knees too close to their chest, and they would get stuck. The spaces are so narrow that the boys often climbed in the buff or in the nude so that they wouldn't get stuck. And there were incredible risks to this work. In addition to getting stuck, you might suffocate. You would be breathing in the carcinogenic soot from the fires, and so could develop cancer. And sometimes the boys were abused by the chimney sweep masters. If they needed to be persuaded to climb higher or climb faster, oftentimes the master sweep would light a fire under their buttocks, or they would prick the bottoms of their feet with a pin to encourage them to move. These children were often orphans or paupers, and so because they didn't have the protection of family, or because their family was incredibly destitute, they were forced into this kind of work. And the boys got no wages whatsoever, but they lived with the master who fed them and clothed them in return for their services. So this is the context for the poem, which is called The Chimney Sweeper.
Okay, so we're going to close read this poem, The Chimney Sweeper, stanza by stanza and line by line. If you haven't already read the poem in its entirety, pause the video and read it to yourself. Okay, here we go. Stanza 1. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me. So in these critical lines here, we learn some of the circumstances that led our young speaker to go into the chimney sweeping business. We learn that his mother passed away. So his mother was his protector and guardian. And with her death, our young speaker is suddenly subject to the predation of the chimney sweep master. And perhaps the father is compelled to sell his son into the chimney sweep business because he can't provide for his necessities. But how tragic that it's the father that sells the boy into servitude. This word sold suggests to me that the young sweep is no longer a person, but a commodity. He is a thing rather than a person, a thing to be sold or exchanged. And he's so young that, as young children sometimes do, he lisps. So he says, weep, 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 instead of sweep, sweep, sweep. So you can imagine, just very young, and he's in the street. He's advertising his services, but he still has the speech impediment of like a toddler. So that's what's going on here, is he can't yet speak correctly. Now, of course, at the same time, the word weep means to cry. And so we're reminded of the pitiful state of the young chimney sweeper, and we're invited to weep for his condition. Yeah. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. It's interesting to me that this word "your," right? You can imagine that the sentence might be written differently. It might have been written, for example, so in Londoners' chimneys I sweep. But instead, we get this very pointed "your." And why do you think Blake used this? Well, I think that "your" points the finger directly at us as the reader. It implicates us. It says, you are not innocent. You are not a bystander watching as others are exploiting me, the sweep. You are my oppressor. And in that sense, I think we have to own responsibility. And it makes us consider the ways in which we are complicit in the exploitation of the world's most vulnerable. Notice that he doesn't have a bed to sleep in, but he's just sleeping in the dirty soot. To me, this, reminds me of, the Christ child who is born in a manger with animals, right? There's the old Christmas hymn about no crib for his bed. I think there's something maybe going on here where there's a connection between the sweep and the Christ child, which is developed further in this second stanza. Tom Dacre is not the speaker. That's important to realize, but a friend of the speaker. And Tom Dacre's head is shaved by the master sweep. And he cries because I think he experiences this as a loss of identity. When your head is shaved and you no longer look like yourself, that can be a kind of crisis. And so he cries. Our speaker then must comfort Tom in this moment where he's lost his identity, and he gives this rather illogical, rather silly consolation. that you know the soot can't spoil your hair if you don't have any hair to spoil. Let's talk about Tom's hair for a moment. Tom's hair curled like a lamb's back. Symbolically, lambs are innocence. Lambs are also weakness. They cannot protect themselves. They don't have teeth or claws to protect themselves from predators, and so rely on the shepherd. It's also a symbol of Christ, the Lamb of God, as he's called in the New Testament. And so, in a sense, I think Tom Dacre becomes all of these things. Tom Dacre, I think, is a lamb to the slaughter. He is, to put it another way, sacrificed on the altar of economic progress. His white hair, I think, has the same connotation as the lamb. It's innocence, it's purity. Like, these young children didn't do anything to deserve the treatment that they're receiving, the abuse that they're receiving. The white hair is innocence because I think at the same time it equals innocence and purity and also youth. Right? Often very young children, my own young children, have white hair. I had white hair when I was very young and grew out of that. At the same time, though, the white hair suggests to me extreme old age. As if these young boys, because of the difficulty of their work, have skipped childhood and skipped adolescence and skipped adulthood, and they're already old men. The extreme difficulty of their work is aging their bodies. The soot that they're breathing in is aging their bodies. The cramped spaces of the chimneys are making it so that their bodies cannot develop or grow. And they're going to live short, stunted lives. Like old men, they're already near death. So I think it's rather clever, I think, that Blake is using this white hair to carry such a heavy symbolic load. Anyway. To me, these lines are very poignant too, because our young speaker, who is himself a parentless child, has to assume the parental responsibility of raising a child younger than himself. He calls Tom Dacre little Tom Dacre, and he must be little indeed if our speaker, who is himself young, thinks of Tom Dacre as little Tom Dacre. And so you get this tragedy of children raising children in the absence of parents and in the absence of protection. In these stanzas here, Tom Dacre has a dream. He's sleeping and he saw such a sight. This is to say that he had a dream. Perhaps you could even call it a vision, right? Because it's interesting to me that it says, he doesn't say has a dream, but he had such a sight, as if this were some kind of revelation or dream or vision. That thousands of sweepers like them are all locked up in coffins of black. This thousands number is important because it reminds us that this is not a story about one sweeper and his friend, but a story about a systemic program of exploitation of large numbers of children. This is a big problem on a societal scale. And they're locked up in coffins of black. In other words, they've died because of the difficulty of their work. Perhaps they've suffocated. Perhaps they've been they've become stuck in the chimneys and have died that way, or they've died from the cancerous. They've died from cancer. They've breathed in the carcinogenic soot. Lots of potential possibilities here. The coffin of black may itself actually just be the chimney. So they're in this dirty tomb. But happily, an angel comes by with a bright key and opens the coffins and sets them all free, which is to say that they're resurrected. This is an important tenet of Christianity, that all the dead will be raised to live again. And they're freed, they're liberated from their black coffins into heaven. And how do the boys think about heaven? Tom does not conceive of heaven as unity with God. He doesn't conceive of heaven as harps or choirs. He thinks of heaven as a green plain on which he and his friends can play around like children, where they can leap and laugh and run and wash in the river and shine in the sun. Heaven, for Tom, is clean. It's a place to play childish games, which is to say that for Tom, heaven, he does not desire like capital S salvation. Not in the way that maybe the Christian creeds would define heaven or salvation. He desires, for him, heaven is just normal childhood luxuries. The luxuries to play, the luxuries to be free from work. And also to be in nature. Now, with urbanization in London, children were cloistered off in these big cities where they didn't have as much exposure to nature, to rivers, and to plains. So this reminds me that Tom Dacre desires nature. Maybe desires to be separate from the city or to be free from the city. In this heavenly vision, he leaves his soot bag behind, and they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And then the poem kind of takes what I think is a dark turn. The angel speaks and promises Tom that if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. Never want joy here means never lack joy. So if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never lack joy, or he'd have joy in abundance. But this phrase here, if he'd be a good boy, the conditional if, is very loaded. Because what is meant by good boy? Well, Tom interprets to be a good boy is to continue with his work. When he wakes in the morning, in the next stanza, as you'll read, he picks up his brush and his sack again and is motivated to continue on in his work. To be a good boy means to be obedient, right? To not rebel, to continue to endure his abuse without complaint. So this angel becomes a voice of oppression. The angel encourages Tom to the angel's message does very little to alleviate the source of Tom's suffering. Tom awakes in the morning, and the speaker, and they get back to their work with this kind of a new hope or new consolation. So religion in these last two stanzas is both an immediate source of consolation and peace for the boys, but at the same time, it does nothing to alleviate their suffering. Religion is not liberating. It is oppressive. The poem ends with this line here. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Now, my question for you today is this line supposed to be read straightforwardly, or is there something ironic about the line? Are we supposed to believe this line? Is this what we're supposed to take away? Now, one maybe useful concept here is this idea of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is when the speaker of the poem, well, let's put it this way, is when there's a difference between what the speaker of the poem says and what the poem actually means. So to put my question another way, the speaker says this. Is this what the poem actually means? And that's where we're going to leave off today. I'm going to ask you to do some thinking and writing, and then we'll come back together and discuss. I'd like you to complete these 3 sentences here. Blake's poem, The Chimney Sweeper, is ironic because... Blake's poem, The Chimney Sweeper, is ironic, but... Blake's poem, The Chimney Sweeper, is ironic, so... Finish these sentences here, and we'll share our answers together in a moment.